Behind every great story sits an author. But for 90% of them, it doesn't just stop there. Some are prolific, their names just as, if not more recognizable than their work. Osamu Tezuka, Junji Ito, Inio Asano, Rumiko Takahashi. Others had smaller works before their massive success. Before Tatsuki Fujimoto writes Chainsaw Man, he does Fire Punch. Ken Wakui did Sekisei Inko before Tokyo Revengers. And JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 3, Stardust Crusaders, never happens without Hirohiko Araki first writing JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 1, Phantom Blood. Conversely, there are the mangakas who had their big hit and still continued to create, even if it was to less fanfare. Author of Tokyo Ghoul, Sui Ishida, is currently doing Chojin X. Naruto's Masashi Kishimoto did Samurai 8. Tsutomu Nihei of Blame fame is now doing Opossums. And we'll get back to that one. And personal favorite of mine, Astro Lost in Space's Kenta Shirahama, is currently serializing Witch Watch. But kinda in the middle of all this, there is an author with 2 series. Neither of which necessarily took the world by storm, but both saw what I'd say is a large amount of success. Of course, I'm talking about Atsushi Okubo. You certainly know him from Soul Eater, and I'm pretty sure you've heard of Fire Force too. With the Fire Force manga having wrapped up recently, I felt it was time to dive back in. See, I had already seen the first 2 seasons of the anime, so given that I already knew what was happening for most of it, I was able to read it with more of an analytical eye than I would have otherwise, taking in not just the story itself, but as one specifically written by Atsushi Okubo, with one of my most recurring thoughts being that Fire Force was not just technically well written, but showed a lot of intentional improvement on a lot of the flaws that his previous had had. But before we can talk about how Fire Force improves on Okubo's previous manga, we first have to talk about Okubo's previous manga. Enter Soul Eater. I've done this bit twice, even, but damn does it put a smile on my face. Run the opening! It's no secret that I love Soul Eater. It's a series very near and dear to my heart. Hell, I was on the fence about buying Elden Ring, but I learned you could play with a scythe, and so I decided to live out my childhood dream of being a Scythe Meister. However, love is not blind, and while I will be the first to sing its praises, I'll also be the first to criticize its problems. And since we're on the topic of disclaimers, yes, I've seen your comments. I know about the ending of Fire Force. However, given the chance, I like to read manga from official sources in translations, so I've only read the 26 that have been released in English. So, while 10 volumes is a lot of room for my opinion to swing in either direction, I still think there's enough here to make a video on. Personally, any discussion on the flaws of Soul Eater need to start at the very beginning, as it helps contextualize where I think Soul Eater goes wrong. After the end of Biichi in May of 2003, Okubo would go on to create a one-shot just 1 month later titled Soul Eater, a bizarre Halloween fantasy world where 2 students at Death Weapon Meister Academy, Maka Albarn and her scythe-transforming partner Soul Eater, are collecting 99 evil souls and 1 witch soul in order to transform Soul into a death scythe. And having just collected their 99th evil soul, all that remains is the witch. Immediately, this is a big hit with the readers, so much so that there are 2 more one-shots that would be created in the same universe, Black Star in September and Death the Kid in November, both following the same concept of teams collecting souls to create death scythes. Reception still being high, Ganken Comics would ask Okubo to create a series out of Soul Eater, with the 3 one-shots becoming the 3 prologue chapters of the series. Anime fans will recognize this as episodes 1, 2, and 3. And so, the series proper starts. due to their antics in the one-shots, our three groups of protagonists are all given remedial lessons, as any souls they collected were confiscated. And it's here I want to pose the question. What is Soul Eater about? Because everything up until I'd say chapter 10 and definitely by chapter 16 lead us to believe that the primary objective of the series is the collecting of 100 souls and creation of a death scythe. Let me now answer my question with a question. Through the entirety of Soul Eater, who do we see do the most soul collecting? Not necessarily who collects the highest amount, but who do we see spend the most time on screen in the act of soul collecting? I'll give you a second. Could it be Death the Kid for having to collect twice as many for his weapons? Or Oxen Harvar? Or maybe it's just the obvious answer, Maka and Soul. Unfortunately, any of these guesses would be wrong. It's none of these students. In fact, it's not even a student, because the Weapon Meister who we see do the most soul collecting is none other than Sid and Nigus, the zombie teacher military spy assassin. Hey, clarification, Sumami here. This isn't true. I had written this in my first ever version of the Soul Eater video, which was about 2 years ago, and I just sort of believed myself. I didn't write down the specific stat, but the number I had in my head was 3. However, going back through, I had made an assumption that there was a guard at Medusa's lair, but there just wasn't. And as a technicality, while he does kill this grunt in the battle for Broo, we don't actually see him collect it. The actual answer is in fact Maka and Soul at 4, 5 or 6, depending on how you want to count it. I don't want to spoil the manga, so I won't get into that here, but if you leave a comment, I'll definitely respond to it. What I will say though is that of the 4 that I would for sure count, 2 of them aren't fully fledged fights, we only see the end. On top of that, it's still such a low number that the point I'm about to make still holds water, even if Maka and Soul hold the crown. Alright, let's get back to it. Whenever he goes out on a mission and takes out an enemy, he'll collect their soul in the process, and while that's a cool bit of world building, that's kind of all soul collecting amounts to in the larger plot of Soul Eater. World building. Which is a shame, because it's such a captivating concept, self-evident in the performance of the one-shots, but has very little to do with the actual story of Soul Eater. It's not inherently a bad thing to deviate from your original premise, but it does force the story to have to constantly introduce new threats and ideas to supplement the progression of the narrative. Where remedial lessons start off as an iteration of soul collecting, it doesn't take long for the story to introduce Medusa and the Black Blood, and then the madness with the revival of the Kishin, and suddenly we're fighting over magical tools? Without anchoring all these ideas in the collecting souls premise, the writing starts to feel less and less like an alive world rife with darkness, and more like a series of contrivances that give our characters something to do. The effects of this being especially felt the longer Soul Eater went on. I do want to give Okubo credit, because I think he does do a good job of introducing the next big antagonist before they become the primary one. We meet the Kishin as Medusa transitions out of the spotlight, and who doesn't really become the big bad until much later. It's in that confusion that Arachne is able to slip in. Eibon is introduced during Baba Yaga Castle, so on and so forth. On top of that, there does become a prevailing theme / narrative around madness, and I do think it's a strong one. However, one of the few places it does fall short is in tying together the antagonists, with their individual motivations being different enough that they're disjointed. There's an irony to me calling soul collecting nothing more than world building, because world building is another area that Soul Eater really feels lacking. Now, hold your initial reaction, because I know a lot of people really like Soul Eater's world building, and I don't want to discount those opinions per se, because there's something to be said about how fun the bizarre nature of it all is. One minute they're taking missions in Italy, Next thing you know, they're in Libya. The Thompson sisters are from Brooklyn. Death City's in Nevada. It's loose and goofy world building, which again, isn't inherently a bad thing. But for the kind of plot Soul Eater is trying to accomplish, I don't really think it fits. Where I think Made in Abyss can pull off such loose world building because the absurdity of the Abyss is baked into the premise, Soul Eater is trying to create a huge world scale conflict, but when it tries to leverage its looser world building is when things fall flat. If I had to summarize how I felt about the locations in Soul Eater, I'd say they were designed for instances, not for narrative. For example, in the anime original ending of Soul Eater, Maka, Soul, Blackstar, and Tsubaki are outside Baba Yaga Castle, which is in the Amazon rainforest. You know, Brazil. And that's fun. Around this same time, Marie and Krona are at Medusa's lair in a nondescript arrow forest. Not a solid place, but the vibe and aesthetic of it are still really vibey and aesthetic-y. Individually, these places are both perfectly serviceable for their specific instance. But when Maka decides to forego the current mission to track down Krona, there's a lack of tension because what Maka and Soul have to go through to get to them is undefined. I do like the show of growth from Maka having to use her soul perception to find Krona, but the actual A-plot B-plot of them getting to Krona whilst they fight Medusa doesn't really work without first knowing what they're doing to get there. The only glimpse we get is them running through nondescript desert. And you need not go any farther than Soul Eater itself to see this kind of plot well done. In the DWMA anniversary arc, we have multiple different parties running through the DWA underground, with our heroes chasing after Medusa's crew who are, in turn, trying to revive the Kishin. And it's super tense because even when there's like 4 different things happening, it's clear how these different plot lines connect to both each other as well as the grander narrative. When Maka arrives at Medusa's lair at the last second, it's a moment that works solely from a hype, reactionary level, as opposed to the payoff of a built tension. On the macro, there's the world-scale conflict. That between DWMA, Arachnophobia, Medusa, and the looming threat of the Kishin. And I think that's great. I think the dynamic between them all is well done. In terms of the actual effect it's having on the world, however, we don't really see anything that isn't immediately relevant to the plot. In the Czech Republic, Arachne is back. The Runaway Express is in the Sahara Desert. The clowns are being made in Russia, but these places were designed for instances, not narrative. This even goes back to the plot structure, a lot of it being what can be boiled down to a series of tracking down MacGuffins, with the locations and world building not existing to convey a grand conflict, but simply facilitate these MacGuffins. That's why when Lord Death says Arachnophobia is turning the tides by constantly threatening the use of one of the demon tools, that's something really cool that we had to be told about, because it's not something that ever takes place in the story. It's lip service more than actual world building. When I think of a series that does this right, I think of Opossums. You're all sleeping on Opossums. That's not conjecture, that's just a fact. Opossums is one of my favorite manga, and in the words of Senku, the odds of it getting its own dedicated video are 10 billion%. So I don't want to detour this video too much. But what I will say in lieu of that video coming out, the very, very least you can do is go to your bookstore of choice, crack open a volume of Opossums, and just admire what I consider some of the most breathtaking art in manga. I am using every ounce of self-control I have not to go into full gush mode right now. The main thing I want to highlight in Opossums is that it takes place on this completely futuristic and artificial planet, one that's also facing a planetary conflict. And as our protagonists travel across the planet, yes, it's still bizarre and varied, but there's a consistency to the bizarre. And the problems of one town are not only indicative of the larger conflict, but will bleed into the next location. Yes, these places still do exist to serve their specific instance, but do so in such a cohesive way that the desolate planet of opossums feels more alive than that of Soul Eater. Just to be clear, I still love Soul Eater, and I don't think any of what I've just said makes Soul Eater a bad story, but that these, as well as one other problem I'm saving for later, are what hold Soul Eater back from being its very best and are, dare I say, its wasted potential. Alright, it's been 14 minutes. You guys want to talk about Fire Force?
人の死因にもいろいろある。老衰、自殺、病死。今この世界で最も多く人々を恐怖させている死因は焼死だ。
That is the core of Fire Force. I'm not saying Fire Force is necessarily a better story, but that it is better written. And it's all gonna come back to that intro, where the premise of Soul Eater was built upon and expanded outwards. Fire Force is by design with something to dive into. People are spontaneously combusting and becoming what's known as infernals, and everything in Fire Force, however tangential, will in some way lead back to that. Fire is something that permeates throughout the entire world in both a thematic and world-building sense. There's no more of this dissonance between the crazy Halloween town of Death City and the regular-ass streets of Italy. In its most basic pitch, Fire Force is about our hero man, Shinra, joining the Fire Force to help save people from the Infernals. Then, as things progress, we learn the true mission of Company 8, to investigate the other companies for potential involvement with spontaneous combustion. We're introduced to the White Clad, a heretical sort of group that at the very least stands in opposition to Company 8, and will have their place in the larger picture of spontaneous combustion. There's a clear sense of cohesion to everything that happens in Fire Force, and I think first and foremost, there's a gratifying sense of progression in the story. With each arc comes a tangible feeling that we're getting closer to an end goal. The end goal of putting an end to spontaneous combustion. Secondly, and arguably just as foremostly, with a clear premise and goal comes agency and impetus. Impetus, the driving force that makes something happen. In a story context, it looks like this: the goal or motivation of your characters. In Megalobox, it's Gearless Joe wanting to win Megalonia. Kaguya wants the president to confess his feelings first. Sugimoto wants to find the hidden gold. Maple doesn't want to get hurt, so she'll max out her defenses. Company 8 wants to put an end to spontaneous combustion. You're smart, so you see the pattern. Characters want to do blank. Agency. The ability for individuals to act independently and make their own choices. Now, it doesn't always have to start that way. Kaiji doesn't seek out the gambling cruise. Joker and Ryuji weren't looking for palaces. The Astra didn't choose to be lost in space. But one of the things that turns a good story into a great one is when the characters break free from circumstance and become the impetus of the story. Ergo, agency. But to truly understand agency, it's best we look at the absence of it. When characters aren't truly making decisions for themselves, but instead letting them be dictated by outside stimulus, they're reactionary. Now, this is an idea lifted wholesale from Super Eyepatch Wolf and his video on Bleach. So, if you wanted to see an example of this in Bleach, go watch his video. But for us, we must once again turn our attention towards Soul Eater. One of the ways you could categorize the plot structure of Soul Eater would be the protecting of the status quo, which in practice means that our characters are never striving for their own goals, instead reacting to outside stimulus. Mind you, the characters are technically working towards a goal, 100 souls to create a death scythe, but as mentioned previously, by moving the plot away from that original premise, Okubo ends up taking away so much of the agency that the characters had. Whether it was Medusa, the Kishin, the Demon Tools, DWMA never sought them out of its own accord, instead reacting to them as they threaten the status quo or sought them out in reaction to a larger threat. There is a lot of individual character motivations. It's where a lot of the good of Soul Eater comes from and what saves it from this agency problem. But even still, it rarely breaks free from being a secondary goal to the primary one of fighting whatever outside force is threatening the status quo. Fire Force does what feels like a very minute flip on that formula, but by making spontaneous combustion the norm that our heroes are trying to break free of, the plot leaves a lot more room for the characters to act of their own accord. Agents reason why they are there, or why they do what they do. So much so, I would even go as far as to say that it helps prop up the world building. Meeting all these characters around Tokyo who have simple but well-defined backgrounds and reasons for why they do what they do makes the locations of Fire Force go from a stage to facilitate the plot to an actual living, breathing locale. And I think no better an example of all of this coming together than the introduction of Inka, the fifth pillar. I don't want to get too lost in the details or spoil a lot of Fire Force. For the purposes of this, just know that there are really important people who have a special connection to fire, and our friend Inka is about to learn that she is one of these people. A fight breaks out with Shinra and Company 8 wanting to take her in to protect her, and the White Clad hoping to use her for nefarious purposes. As they're fighting though, Inka has no intention of being saved, and after a bit of deliberation, willingly goes with Charon, which is crazy considering this is the man who just killed her friend. Because that's not where her story starts. We actually meet Inka right before this. Known as the Fire Thief, she has the uncanny ability to sense fires before they happen. While she did end up saving people, it was never from a place of compassion, rather using the opportunities to profit off the misfortuned. There's a case to be made to jump right into the fight over Inka, letting the moment she joins the Evangelist be one of shock. But instead, Okubo opted to introduce her beforehand and contextualize her decision-making, giving her agency and, in turn, the people and world feeling that much more alive. I really like the characters of Fire Force. I do think they can be a bit simple, but as I've said in my Bakuman video, I think a large cast of simple characters can be a good thing, and Fire Force, in my opinion, pulls that off really well. Except for one. In my Soul Eater video, I make the claim that in Volume 1 of Soul Eater, there are what I think is an excessive amount of lewd and fanservice-y jokes that are to the detriment of Soul Eater. And let me tell you, not a lot of people, but a decent handful of people called me some variation of sexist prude boy who hates sex, which was more amusing than anything just because it was so clear that they were just kind of getting upset for the sake of it and didn't really do anything to address the actual point I was trying to make. In that video, it was just a passing point, but I want to break it down a bit more because it's something I think it's important for the manga industry to hear. Bear with me because I'm going to open with a metaphor. I've watched my fair share of the Great British Bake Off, and there are numerous occasions where someone will bake something, like, and I'm totally making up flavors here, a lemon zest egg tart with a hint of cinnamon. And Paul Hollywood will go up there and say, you know what, I like what you were going for, but even that little bit of cinnamon is enough to overpower your entire tart. You might see where I'm going with this. In any given series, there are the main appeals and the secondary ones. To give an example, I think the Toaru series, A Certain Magical Index and Scientific Railgun, have really fun and inventive magic/power systems. That is the core appeal. And as a secondary appeal, there's a strong level of grounding in real scientific and religious ideas and concepts that could really add to the experience for some and completely go over the heads of others. Agent Demi-Human is a kick-ass manga about a race of human who always revive when they die and can summon these black ghosts. The appeal being in how the manga then becomes not about which character can punch better than the other, but who can come up with a better strategy that will overwhelm their opponent. On top of that, there's a lot of small political commentary and jabs littered throughout the manga. Not to the point that I would call it a political drama, but it's an extra thing to pitch on top of the exciting strategy-centric fights. When I think of Soul Eater, I think of people turning into weapons, collecting evil souls, and stopping the spread of madness. The exciting fights, the funky fresh style, that is what makes Soul Eater Soul Eater. That's our lemon zest. Fan service is a cinnamon. I'm not saying it's a bad flavor, but that it's a strong one. If it's not the main flavor, then you have to be careful with it or it's gonna overpower the tart. I think there are plenty of great animes that make cinnamon a main flavor. The main one I can think of is Gleipnir, where Shuichi transforms into this big mascot beast and Claire gets inside him to pilot him basically, and the subtlety is not there. But it's something that they lean into. Conversely, I was recently blown away reading Dan to Dan, and the tone of that manga is so bizarre, and there are moments where it's very crass and very silly, and any moments that are in any way fan servicey are done so with such nonchalance that the plot still flows naturally, never stopping in their tracks to be like, uh-oh, they're not symmetrical. I really like Soul Eater, but when I hand someone a lemon zest tart and their first bite is full of cinnamon, who am I to be upset if they say it's not for them? It's so hard to recommend Soul Eater on the merits of its epic fights, fun characters, and engaging conflict because it's all overshadowed in episode 1, dedicating majority of its runtime to oops, cat girl naked. Once again, these first 3 episodes / chapters were the original one-shots that Okubo did before fully serializing, and while I can understand them in the context of one-shots, I think when given the green light to create a series, they should have been rewritten to better match the direction the series heads in. Again, not because fan service is inherently bad, but because it's divisive, and unnecessarily adding it in could lose you more fans than you stand to gain. Or worse, doing so poorly risks completely ruining your characters or parts of your story as a whole. I'm not going to go into any detail, but if you've read the last chapter of Soul Eater, you know what I'm talking about. And for what I thought was going to be the main topic of this video, Fire Force, despite all the praise I want to give it, I can't not talk about Tamaki Kotatsu. To steal another quote from Super Eyepatch Wolf, "Ah lads, what are we doing here? I don't like what was done with her character. I think so much of it clashes with what makes Fire Force so good. Where else is there to start, other than Lucky Lesher Lure? The given name to the, I guess, affliction that she has that causes her to constantly stumble into lewd situations. Firstly, it's nonsense. I know that the main character flies by shooting fire out of his feet, but that's grounded both thematically and in the power system that the series has set up. Lucky Lesher Lure is not explained by anything, but instead exists to explain away all the moments Okubo wanted to make a fan service out of Tamaki. Keyword, moment. Because whenever her Lucky Lesher activates, the story stops whatever it's doing to be like, oops, cat girl naked. Which, especially in the middle of a fight scene, can feel like a total derailing of the momentum for no reasonable gain. And most egregiously, it's uncomfortable. And I don't just mean for the audience. Where a character like Clarioki from Gleipnir gets away with being lewd because her character is seductive and erotic, or better example, Captain Hibana in Fire Force. People love how she walks on people and calls them gravel, and I think a big part of that is because she clearly enjoys walking on people and calling them gravel. Whereas with Tamaki, it's pretty clearly portrayed that she does not enjoy the Lucky Lesher Lure, which just leaves us with a girl who is constantly being put in these humiliating positions for the sake of it. And that's just bad female character writing. The absolute worst moment being in the Raid of the Nether, where Tamaki, who's been separated from the rest of the squad, verbalizes her desire to prove that she's more than just a damsel in distress, who constantly needs saving, and is given an exact scenario to prove just that. Only for her Lucky Lesher Lure to activate and be the thing to quote-unquote defeat Assault, taking any agency Tamaki had in that moment and completely ripping it away from her, along with any sense of character growth she might have had. I do want to acknowledge that around volume 22, she does start to train and take steps towards progression, and while that is admirable, volume 22 out of 36 is, to put it as optimistically as I can, better late than never. I've spent the past 3 months writing this video, and in that time, the third and potential final season of Fire Force has been announced. Although, I guess the idea of a final season doesn't really mean shit nowadays, does it? Anyways, I am so excited. Fire Force is such a well-written series that I'm so glad to see that it's getting the love and attention it deserves, both from a production standpoint and fan reception. Mr. Okubo, if these words somehow reach you, I want you to know that I'm really proud of you. This is complete conjecture, but to me at least, I feel like this was the kind of story you wanted to tell. A world plagued with a darkness that runs a lot deeper than anyone could imagine, and through the use of an inventive power system, our protagonists have to help stop this world-ending threat. And I don't think you could quite wrangle Soul Eater to become that story to its fullest. But come Fire Force, you approached it with planning and foresight, and it has paid dividends. It's why the world building feels so tight. It's why the progression feels so satisfying. It's why Fire Force is better written than Soul Eater. Thank you.